It's a sad fact of our history that the contribution made by slaves in the American Revolutionary War is nowadays often overlooked. So in order to fix this, I came out to tell the story of Mammy Kate, who's buried here beside me, along with her husband and her former master, Stephen Hurd. And the story goes that Mammy Kate was, to all who knew her, an incredibly wise woman. It's said that she was the royalty of an African tribe being captured directly from Africa, and that her father was the king of one of the most powerful tribes in the continent. Although being a slave, this history was never really documented, and we don't know what tribe she belonged to specifically. And it was also said that she was over 6 feet tall and had an incredibly powerful strength. And this comes into play later in the story. Now her master, a man named Stephen Hurd, whose history I'll give in a moment, he was captured at the Battle of Kettle Creek, which is a crucial moment for Georgia during the Revolutionary War. Now what you ought to know about this battle is that the Patriots won and the British suffered heavy losses. But during their retreat, they managed to capture Stephen Hurd and brought him back to Fort Augusta, which was at the time in firm British control. And they slated him for execution very soon. And so hearing the news of this, Mammy Kate got onto one of his Arabian horses, and it said that she rode over 50 miles in one night, parking the horse just outside of town. She approached the British fort and made statements in support of their government, saying that she was a loyalist and a Tory and wanted to help them in any way that she could. So by using the skills that she'd learned over a very long life of being a slave, she ingratiated herself into the British ranks. And using this, she approached her master and basically said, don't pretend like you don't notice me, pretend like you don't know me rather, and I will help provide you. I'll get you out of this sticky situation. So she argued with the British, or persuaded them to give her master clean clothes. And eventually she managed to get her master to wiggle through the bars and put her master on a clothes basket and walked right out of the front gates, out of the camp, and boarded the two horses and rode off back to Stephen Hurd's home near Kettle Creek, about 50 miles north. And in order to pay her respect for this, Stephen Hurd offered both her and her husband freedom. And it was something that she rejected. She said, I will not leave you, you won't be rid of me. And so she was given a cabin and a small tract of land on the outskirts of Stephen Hurd's property. She continued to be the nanny of their children for many years, and her husband also continued to work the land. Now, here's where the story gets a little bit complicated. This was used in order to justify the institution of slavery during the antebellum South in Georgia. So while Mammy Kate herself is an incredibly important figure and actually did perform acts of heroism, her story was used in order to justify the need for slavery and portray it as a noble and loyal institution, and in order to portray Mammy Kate as a good slave, somebody who understood her place and understood that she could provide so long as she was within the bounds of where she belonged, which is the master and the slave relationship. And so on her deathbed, when the master offered her freedom, or freedom to her family, she said, I bequeath to you my husband and my children. And they naturally had no choice in this, but they remained the slaves to the Stephen Hurd family. And I don't believe that Stephen Hurd was well known as an evil person, but she still chose the fate of her family to remain in servitude to somebody who was one of the first governors of the state of Georgia. And so naturally this history has been used to justify a lot of evil things, but the story of Mammy Kate herself is an incredibly compelling story. The story of a slave who rescued her master and helped turn the tide of the American Revolution and became known as one of the most loyal people in the state of Georgia. In the same cemetery as Mammy Kate and her husband is buried her master, a man named Stephen Hurd. And I think that Stephen Hurd is so interesting because he was actually the provisional president and provisional governor of the state of Georgia, a president which doesn't exist as a title anymore. And Stephen Hurd made a name for himself in the French Indian Wars, and during this period of time he was fighting alongside George Washington, which during the Revolutionary War immediately put him a step ahead of everybody else. And in reward for his loyalty to the British Empire when he was fighting in the French Indian Wars, he was given a large amount of land on which he established Fort Heard, which now is the foundation for the town of Washington. And back during the Revolutionary War, it became the provisional capital of the state of Georgia, something which isn't really talked about historically anymore because it was only for a very short period of time. But Fort Heard was used for travelers going between Augusta and other backcountry areas in the state in order to protect them from the hostile wilderness as well as the unfriendly Native Americans, because at the time it was close to the borders of the Cherokee Nation and the Creeks. And Heard was very heavily influenced because when he started fighting the Revolutionary War, people, I believe in 1778, really took to hating him. Because again, the backcountry of Georgia was very heavily loyalist. So they burned his house down when he was away and forced his wife and daughter out into a snowstorm where they died of exposure. And this really solidified his resolve to help fighting for the Patriot cause. Now, when the Battle of Kettle Creek came along, this came as a decision by the British to move their forces away from the northern part of the colonies and into the deep south, because a lot of the backcountry here in Georgia supported the British in their cause. And a decision was made to march out of Fort Augusta, which was heavily occupied by the British and would later come to be Stephen Heard's prison for a short period of time until he was rescued by Mammy Kate. They marched into the country in order to gather support, drum up morale, and impress farmers into the British Army. And when they caught wind of this, General Elijah Clark, along with Stephen Heard, began fighting in the Battle of Kettle Creek. And they really surrounded the British and slaughtered a lot of them on top of War Hill, but the British did manage to make it off with Stephen Heard. Now, I think his history is so interesting because he was a president of the state of Georgia. And the state of Georgia nowadays obviously doesn't have a president. But during this period of time, politics was such a nebulous or up-in-the-air issue. It was so difficult to find out who was who politically. So Georgia was, for all intents and purposes, during this short period during the Revolutionary War, an independent republic from the British Empire with its capital in what is now Washington, Georgia, although at the time it was Fort Heard. Now, Heard himself is not a very well-known figure in Georgia history, but I think that his story really deserves telling because of his ephemeral time as president of Georgia and then as early colonial governor fighting against the British Empire.